Hi again everyone, Michael Volshinovich here from Vibrant Shot, and today we're going to be looking at dodging and burning in probably more detail than you ever cared to know. But we're going to be spending a lot of time on it in a slightly different approach. I'm not going to be kind of taking you through, half an hour of just watching me paint in, shadows and highlights. I'm going to do a little bit of that just to give you the general idea of what we're going for. But what I'm going to be spending most of my time on is looking at 4 different approaches to dodging and burning, and taking you through some best practices that you can use within each of those techniques to ensure that your images just look as good as they can. So, as far as dodging and burning itself goes, the concept is pretty simple, but I think it really is one of the most powerful ways to make your images go from looking, just pretty good to looking really fantastic. And even though, typically you associate dodging and burning with portrait images, it's, equally useful for architecture, landscape, and really any other kinds of photography. So, in this particular video, we're obviously going to be focused on portraiture, but you can apply any of these techniques to any other type of photo. So I'm going to start off with this particular portrait over here, and as you can see, very nice portrait. Essentially, we've done a little bit of basic skin retouching to it, and not much else. So what you're seeing here is pretty much out of the camera with a little bit of color adjustment. So what we're going to try and do is really just kind of shape the face and really give it a little bit more depth than what it has right now. And so I've already done that with a few quick applications of dodging and burning within this after group over here. So if I just toggle that on and off, you can pretty much immediately see, how much nicer everything starts to look. You get a lot more dimension in the face, the highlights really start to come out. So it really takes the image up a notch. And, this is maybe after 10 or 15 minutes of work. So it's really not a huge time commitment. So the 4 methods that we're going to be looking at, the first approach is probably the most common approach, and that essentially is taking a 50% neutral gray layer and doing our dodge and burn on that. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the technicalities of that approach and really demonstrating that approach, but I'm going to talk about some of the limitations of it so you can be aware of it and know when to use it and when not to use it. Second approach is going to involve essentially a series of curves adjustments. So we're going to use that to do our dodge and burn. Again, I'm going to kind of talk about where that works and where it doesn't. Third, we're going to just basically look at when you can dodge and burn directly on a particular layer. And finally, the fourth version is going to be a little bit different. It's probably something you've never seen before, and it's an approach that I use occasionally. And basically, it involves doing a frequency separation technique coupled with a light and dark layer that we're going to use for the dodging and burning on those. So if you are completely uninterested in anything else other than that, then feel free to fast forward this video and just watch that. But hopefully we can give you some good insights on dodging and burning and where to use one technique over another. So let's just go ahead and get started. So this first approach, as I said, is probably what you'll see most commonly in other videos. And basically, we're just going to create 2 new layers. So we're going to hold down Shift Command N or Shift Control N. That's going to give us this new layer dialog. So we can just call this DB for Dodge Burn. And then we're going to select our blend mode. So the 2 options that you have for blend modes are Overlay and Soft Light. Overlay will be a little bit more punchy. Essentially, it will get you to the dodged or burned effect much quicker. Soft light is just going to be a little bit more of a gradual build-up, so it's really up to you which one you choose. I usually tend to go with overlay just to get me there faster. Now, as far as actually other options, you're going to want to select this fill with overlay neutral gray color, 50%. Essentially, that's just going to make our layer middle gray. Now, you don't actually have to do this. You can just use a transparent layer and paint in black or white. But, and the effect is really pretty much the same. We're just going to start with this neutral gray approach just because that's really what people tend to use most often. So we're going to create 1 copy of that, and I'm just going to hit Command J to create another copy. So we're going to call this Dodge, we're going to call this one Burn, and we're going to group this together, hitting Command G into DB 50%. Gray. Okay, so that's going to be our first approach. And again, the best thing to do is to have an action for this, which basically just creates the group with these 2 layers in it so that you don't have to go through this process every time. And what I will do is I will create actions for all these different things that we're going to be doing today, so that essentially you can just pick that action. It will set up the base for you, so you don't have to go through and manually recreate this. But we'll cover the steps just so you understand what's involved. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our burn, and I usually start with burning simply because once I define my shadows, I find it's a little bit easier to see how much I have to brighten the highlights in order to make things look really good. So we're going to start off by selecting our burn tool, so that's just right here. We're going to make sure that our brush is at 0% hardness, exposure should be around 5%, and as far as the range goes, just select midtones. Whether you select shadows, midtones, or highlights, it doesn't make too much of a difference when you're working on a 50% gray layer. It does make more of a difference when you're actually working directly on the layer, which we'll see a little bit later. But in the case of a neutral gray layer, just midtones is fine. And the protect tones option, some people you'll watch the tutorials and they say, definitely have protect tones turned on. It's fantastic. So I think it came in around CS5, and yes, it's a really nice feature when you're dodging and burning directly on the actual image layer. But when you're doing this on a 50% gray layer, it actually makes no difference. So if somebody's demonstrating that, you can pretty much ignore that option. You can have it turned on, doesn't hurt anything, but don't also expect it to do anything for you. So we can just leave it turned on, knowing full well that it will do nothing for us. So taking our burn tool on our burn layer, we're just going to start essentially brushing onto our image. So it does really help if you have a Wacom tablet to do this, just because it's a little bit hard to do on a touchpad. So we're just going to, for example, brush along here just to define this jawline, maybe around the nose here. Just around here, around the cheeks, underneath the chin, somewhere in around there, and then we can, darken the neck, just above the clavicle, some of these shadows here, and so on and so on. So that's basically a quick burn. As we can see, we haven't really done too much, and obviously if I was doing this for a client, I would spend a lot more time on it, but in this case we're just doing it for demonstration purposes. But as you can see, the idea is always to darken up the shadows and just kind of define the edges of the face, and some areas where you want to, for example, bring out the cheekbones. We can darken this part of the face, and so on and so on. So I'm not going to really cover too much of the actual painting because I think there's just way too many videos out there that already do the same thing. So we're going to basically go right into our dodge layer, and we're going to quickly do some dodging, and that's about as much as we're going to cover in terms of the painting itself. But then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems we run into with this. So if to do the dodge, again, we're just going to select our dodge tool, go into our dodge layer around 5 or 6% again, midtone selected, protect tones, doesn't matter, and we're just going to brush in on this area here. Now we see one thing that we want to take care of when doing dodge and burn is areas of transition that are not smooth. So as we can see over here, if I just reduce my brush size, over here in this area we see a bit of a highlight. Down here we see something of a highlight, and here there's a little bit of a dark spot. So we have two options. We can either darken this portion using burn or lighten this portion using dodge. So I'm probably going to just go back and quickly burn that area in just very lightly. And we see that we immediately have a more smooth transition there. So that's one thing that you can definitely use dodge and burn for. And then in our dodge layer, we're just going to go right back, and we're going to go ahead and lighten again. So we can now lighten this area, maybe lighten under the eyes, create a bit of a highlight in the nose. I'll typically dodge above the lips as well, and sometimes if I'm doing a beauty retouch, I'll actually dodge a highlight around the lips, but to do that you do generally have to have a path around the lips just to make it look nice and clean. Also look nice if you actually dodge some of the lips on the inside as well. You can add a little bit more dimension to them that way. Usually under the chin is a good place to do a little bit of dodging. And in that case, this is probably pretty good for this particular portrait. And then we can just bring out the clavicles as well. So if we just toggle our dodge and burn layer on and off, we see that, it's a pretty subtle effect. We haven't really done too much with it, but immediately we've kind of brought out some more dimension in the face. And in this case, we've evened out this little bit of uneven skin. So essentially, it can take all of 2 or 3 minutes, and it can make a huge difference. Now let's talk about where we run into problems with this. So if we go into our burn layer, for example, and let's say we really want to kind of increase the shadow here. We want to actually make this a little bit darker and really bring out that cheekbone. So let's say I'm just going to quickly, bring this up to 25-30%, which you never really want to do, but for demonstration purposes, that's just fine. So we're over here, and let's say we start bringing up the shadows here. Watch what happens. If we start brushing this in, immediately you can see that the color of the actual skin starts to change, and it looks pretty ugly. All of these red tones start coming out of the skin, and it just looks like she's got a bruise on her face. So we do not want that at all. And that's where this protect tones is supposed to come in, and it does help. And then we'll see that when we're actually directly on our layer. But in this case, really is not doing anything for us. So same thing. If we start brushing in here, we see that when we're actually in the shadow area, everything is okay because we haven't really pulled out too much of the skin tone. But as soon as we start encroaching on these mid-tones over here, a lot of that red skin tone, orange skin tone just starts to come out, and it just doesn't work. You really don't want that effect at all. So this approach definitely has its limitation. You can't really go too far with it. So if you're going to just work on primarily on the existing shadows and highlights, and you're not planning on going too crazy with it, this is a perfectly good approach to use. But if you are actually planning on changing midtones and making them into deeper shadows, and taking midtones and making them bright highlights, this is just not a good approach because it does change the hue and saturation of the skin as you start to dodge and burn. So only use it if you're not going to go too far with it. So that's all we're going to cover in this particular approach, and we're going to move on to the next approach, which is to use curves. Alright, so our next approach is again one that you may have seen, and basically it involves two curves adjustments. So the first one we're going to create is going to be for our burn. So we're going to create a curves adjustment, and we're going to just bring down our midtones so that essentially we're darkening the entire image. And then the next thing we're going to do, and it's something that's often overlooked when people use this approach, is to change the blend mode of that layer to luminosity. And as you can see, what that basically does is if we kind of toggle between the two blend modes, is under luminosity, we're not bringing out as much of the red tone here. It's kind of preserving the overall tones and really just bringing down the luminosity of those colors as opposed to affecting hue and saturation. So we're going to do that again. We're going to create another curves adjustment layer. We're going to make this one our dodge layer, so we're going to make everything a little bit brighter. Once again, making the layer, the blend mode, luminosity. We're going to invert each of these layer masks, so we're going to hit Command I and Command I again. Holding Shift, we're going to hit Command G to group this together, and we're just going to say this is called Curves Dodge Burn. I'm going to take off this previous dodge and burn, and we're going to start working on here. So just to kind of verify here, let me just make sure that's our dodge layer there. So let's just name that. Once again, the actions that I will include will basically build this for you. Okay, and so in order to essentially burn in our image, all we're going to do is select our brush, once again making it very soft, so 0 hardness. Flow will be around probably 3 to 4%, and we just do exactly what we did before. So again, we're going to just brush this in. Again, not spending too much time on this because I think you probably understand how the mechanics of dodge burn works. But again, if we just toggle this on and off, we see we've essentially achieved the same effect that we had previously, just using our 50% gray layer. And dodge, again, same process. All we're going to do is just reduce our brush size. Sorry about that. What are you doing? That's not what I want at all. Brush tool. There we go. All right. So now we're just going to brush on the highlight on the nose, highlight here. We're going to accent the lips a little bit, on the chin, on the clavicle. And if we, wow, what happened here? Dodge copy. Let's just delete this old one here in that case if we're working on this one. Yes. Okay. So toggling this on and off, we see that, again, we've pretty much done the same thing, in this case using just our curves adjustments. Now the one nice thing about this is that the curves adjustment essentially serves as a limit to how far you can dodge and burn, because obviously if we essentially paint this white, if we were to paint this entire image white, we essentially get to this level. So this is as far as we can go with burning, and if we took this dodge layer and we made it white, essentially we get to this point. So that's kind of the maximum amount that we can go, whereas with the 50% gray layer, you can obviously go a little bit further with it than that. Now, one other thing that we can do is, let's say that we take our dodge layer, let's say we've got our tool, and we were quite liberal with actually doing this. So let's say we went in here and we started dodging this out, and we don't really want that, right? We don't want to take this dark shadow here and actually dodge it. What we can do is we can use the blend tools, which you've probably seen me use quite a few times now in a couple of different videos, and we basically get to that just by right-clicking and going to blending options. And then in here, if we start sliding this, we see that immediately this area here where we weren't supposed to go into, it starts to go away, but obviously not looking too good right now. So as always, we're going to split this slider by holding option, and we're just going to start dragging that. As you can see, if we drag that over, essentially we're not applying the dodge to that area of shadow. So whatever was originally a shadow, we don't want to apply a dodge to it. We just want to apply dodge to areas that are supposed to be highlights. Now, the only time you don't want to do this is if, for example, we were in this spot over here and we were, for example, burning this, and we sort of did this on the other end. So obviously when you're if you're doing your dodge layer, you're sliding in this direction. If you're doing a burn layer, you're going to be sliding the highlights over. So if you're actually replacing a mid-tone with a shadow or a highlight, you may not want to do this, because essentially it will negate the effect like we had over here that would essentially get rid of that. So the only time you want to really do this is if you know that you're just bringing up highlights and just deepening shadows. But that's basically just a nice way of making sure that your dodge doesn't apply to your shadows and your burn doesn't apply to your highlights. So just a little tangent there, but really nice technique for making sure that you target things properly. So let me just go back on that. We don't want to apply that there. And so that is our final effect. And that's really all I'm going to say about that adjustment method. Actually, one more thing I will say is that, again, the nice thing here is that even if we went to full white, we're never really making these skin tones ridiculously red. I mean, obviously we're bringing out a little bit of it here because there was red color there to begin with, but it's certainly not as bad as what we saw using our 50% gray layer. So now we're going to look at the third approach, which is basically taking our actual layer and doing some dodging and burning on that. So Command J, we're just going to duplicate this, and obviously make sure that you at least duplicate the layer. While this is just not an ideal approach to begin with, at least duplicate the layer so you can modify the amount of effect that you're going to be applying. And obviously if you make a mistake, you can always just delete the layer and start again. Now, speaking about reducing effect, obviously if at any point you find that this effect is too strong, we can just take the entire opacity of that particular group down and reduce the amount of effect. So that's all pretty straightforward. Now, the only time I ever really dodge and burn directly on a particular layer is if I have one really small thing that I want to fix. So let's say I just don't like this little spot, and everything else I'm just going to take it as is. I may just duplicate the layer, select this, take the exposure down to something fairly low like 5%, size my brush accordingly, and just very gently burn in there to make the skin transition even. So if we just toggle that on and off, we see that that has helped to do that. And that is a good place to essentially use the actual layer to dodge and burn. But if you were going to go in and globally sort of adjust all these shadows here and bring up highlights, it's really not what you want to be using it for. So the only time you're going to do that is essentially if you're doing a little bit of minor touch-up quickly. And when you do that, obviously make sure that Protect Tones is turned on, because it does make a difference, and I'll sort of show you how that will work. If we take our exposure up a lot and start painting in here, we see that again we're starting to kind of recreate that same problem that we had with the skin tones getting kind of ugly. But that's really nothing compared to what will happen if we turn Protect Tones off. So if we take this and turn off, as you can see, it gets really, really bad. So essentially doubles that effect to what we had previously. So Protect Tones works, just not on a 50% gray layer. It only works when you're directly on that layer. So deleting this layer over here, we're going to look at our final approach, which is, I think, probably the most interesting, and it's probably going to be one that you've never seen before. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we'll do to get started is to create two copies of this particular background layer. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your background layer, it's just whatever your image, your highest image layer is. So we're going to hit Command J twice, and we're going to name our bottom layer low, so that's basically for low frequency, and high for high frequency. So as I mentioned, essentially this is kind of a different version of the frequency separation approach for doing skin retouching, but we're going to sort of put a different spin on it. So we're going to disable our top layer, the high layer. We're just going to use our low layer for starters. We're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And now we are going to modify our radius so that it basically takes out any sort of detail and just leaves us with mostly skin texture. So I'm going to click OK. And that will just blur out our image. Now obviously this does not look good, and don't worry, we're not going to leave things there. We're going to now go into our high layer. We're going to check that so that it's visible. We're going to modify our blend mode to linear light. We're going to go to Image, Apply Image. Once I find it here, there we go. And what you want to make sure that you have as far as settings is so that your source layer is the low layer that we created, so that's this one here. You're going to want to make sure invert is checked off, blending is on add, and the scale is 2. Now these settings only work if you have a 16-bit image. If you've got an 8-bit image, I believe that you have to have invert unchecked. This should be 128, but I will double check those values and I'll make sure that they're posted inside the blog that corresponds to this particular video. And also the actions that I create will have one version for 8-bit and one version for 16-bit. So don't get hung up on the details of these apply image values. That'll be available to you after this video. So we're going to click OK. And again, we're just going to group this together into, we'll call it frequency separation, dodge burn. Now next thing we're going to do is we're going to select our low layer. We're going to create 2 blank layers above that. So this particular layer here we're going to fill with white. So since white is our foreground color, we're going to hit Option Delete to fill with foreground color. We're going to go to this layer. Since black is our background color, we're going to hit Command Delete to fill with the background layer. We're going to add a layer mask to both of these. So we're going to hold Option to add a black layer mask, Option to add a black layer mask there. And now this is going to become our burn, and this is going to become our dodge. Now you don't have to use black and white specifically. This can be really any light tone, so maybe you want to use sort of a light peachy kind of color, so it's going to represent your highlight. You may not want your highlight to go completely white, and it never really will because we'll never be bringing it out that much. And same with the black, like it doesn't have to be black, it could be in this case a very dark brown. You can really choose whatever colors you want there and whatever colors make your image look best. Now, if we were, for example, dodging these highlights in the hair, what we would do is we would create a layer in here that has the same color as sort of the brightest hair highlights. So for example, let's just go ahead and do that. We're going to create a new layer here. We're going to sample our color. So we're going to find a color that is nice and bright. So let's say, oh, this highlight over here is probably pretty good. We're going to go in and maybe just brighten that a little bit more, something like that. So what we can do is we can just go ahead and fill that layer. So Option Delete, fill with foreground. Again, we're going to mask that out. And now we can start brushing that in. So we're going to take our brush size and obviously drop it down quite substantially. Flow is going to have to be pretty low in this case. You're going to be keeping it at around 1 to 2%. For hair, you can probably keep it at 2 to 3%. And as you can see, if we start to kind of brush the highlights in, we're going to start bringing them out with that lighter hair color. Now, if you were dodging the hair highlights in any of these different approaches, you would just do the same thing as you were doing with the skin. You select a dodge tool and just go over the highlights of the hair. So no real mystery there. And again, once we do this, we can use the same blend if technique we saw earlier to make sure that this dodging is constrained to just the hair highlights. And I have a whole video on bringing out hair highlights, so I'm not going to focus on this too much. But as you can see, really quickly we have dodged the hair highlights, but also we've left the detail of the hair intact because we've created this high frequency layer above it. So this high frequency, basically it's all the detail in the image is in that particular layer. if we took this layer and brought it to the top and we started painting over it, essentially it would start covering the details of our hair. We obviously don't want that. If we just bring this out here, you can't really see it because the effect is pretty subtle, but essentially what happens is the more and more you dodge, the more and more you'll actually cover the detail within the strands of hair. So that's why it's necessary to do this frequency separation beforehand. Now, if we want to work on the face, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to select our burn layer on the layer mask. So obviously we're doing all of this on the layer mask, not on the layer itself. And again, in this case, flow, I'm going to keep it at probably around 1%. And of course, if we overdo anything, which is pretty easy to do with this approach, we're just going to drop the opacity down a little bit. So again, we're going to get started just by painting in those shadows. Bringing in some of our highlights. And the great thing about this technique is, while the other ones, essentially what they're doing is they're taking whatever color is there and they're either brightening it or darkening it, and which is sort of a destructive process. Here we're not really doing that. All we're doing is we're overlaying a certain amount of black or a certain amount of white over top of the existing image. So we're not being as destructive to the original tones as we were before, because essentially what I can do is, if I take this burn layer over here, and as you can see, I can essentially take my flow up tremendously, and obviously we'll just be painting black over top of it, so some of the texture will stay in there, but we don't want that either. But the nice thing is that we can gradually build up that particular color, and again, this doesn't have to be black. We can make this to be sort of a middle brown if that's what we want to introduce as our color within the jawline. But in this case, I just selected black because within the shadows I'm perfectly happy painting in black. So you have to make sure that, again, flow is right down to a minimum here, and we can start painting that in. So if we kind of toggle this on and off, we see that that effect has been applied, and obviously if I was doing this for a client, I'd spend more time to make sure that this is all even, and I'd probably match up that color to the color. So we may end up with maybe 6 or 7 of these layers to really create a nice blend, and this obviously will avoid that problem of creating any sort of redness within the skin, because ultimately we're choosing what color we want to introduce. So this approach obviously will take the most amount of time, but I find that it can create the best results. So it really just depends on what are you doing. What are you retouching? A beauty shot? Are you retouching, a high school portrait? Depending on how much you're making for that particular photo, you're going to want to invest more or less time. So this is definitely the biggest investment, but it can create the best results. Now, one thing I'll also mention with any of these dodge and burn layers is, at any point if you find that your dodging and burning is a little too abrupt, for example, you can actually see the brush strokes. One thing you can do is, if we just toggle this layer on, or off I should say, and we bring back our previous one. Actually, let's go with our curves adjustment here. If we actually look at the burn layer itself, so if we hold Shift and if we hold Option and click on that mask, we see that the actual lines that we've created here aren't really overly smooth, and maybe we want them to be. We don't want to create these sort of abrupt ends and divots here. So what we can really do to smooth that out is we can just go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just pick an appropriate blur amount that will essentially clean that up. So for example, if we blur at 40, and we hold Option again just to see the actual effect. If we Command Z and sort of toggle back and forth, you can't really see it too much in this case, but essentially it will create a softer transition for you. So it really depends on the circumstance. Sometimes you need to do this, sometimes you don't, but you can pretty much do it anytime you have this layer mask over here, and you can also do it on these 50% gray layers. So that again is one nice thing about using some sort of a layer to do the dodging and burning, as opposed to doing it directly on the actual background layer, because when you do it there and you do a Gaussian blur, obviously you'll blur the entire image as opposed to just the actual dodge and burn portion. So again, I know that was a ton of information about dodging and burning, but hopefully you learned some new techniques, and you learned when to use and when not to use some of the techniques you may already know. So again, hopefully you found that helpful, and we'll see you next time.